Hare Krishna, Nrsimhananda P, humble obeisances. Thank you
Hare
very
Krishna.
much for joining for today's Monk's podcast.
Thank you for having me.
We have corresponded over the years on quite a few occasions with respect to your pioneering service in ISKCON Television, as well as on some other issues. And several devotees recommended that we have you for the podcast. And then Krishna Dharma Prabhu mentioned about the SABHA initiative. So I thought that could also be a forum where we could discuss today. So maybe we can start with your journey within to Krishna consciousness and within Krishna consciousness. You are quite a leading member in our movement, especially in the Western world, in terms of your various services. So could you start with how you were introduced and how your services evolved over the decades?
Yeah. My introduction to Krishna consciousness was the Back to Godhead magazine that I received from a Mataji in the Tottenham Court Road Underground station in London as I was going to the school where I studied and got a master's degree in film, the London Film School. And I was in London for 2 years. In 1971, I looked at that magazine and was wonderstruck with the beautiful picture of Krishna. And when I looked up after ascending the stairs of the underground station, I nearly got run over by a bus. And in front of my nose, there was an advertisement which I read just in time to save my life. It said, "In your head, you know it's right." And when I went to the school, the principal had my diploma in their hand. And when they handed it to me, they said, "Here's your diploma from the School of Illusion."
School of Illusion, okay.
The next 3 days, which were my final days in London, were just like that. I tried to call the temple in those days, but there was, as usual, no answer. So by the time I arrived in Chicago, where I live, I was very curious about what is this Hare Krishna thing. And because everything I read in that magazine made perfect sense. And I went directly from the airport to these small apartments in a very rundown part of town. It was very late. It was a Sunday. I got there. They were having a class at around 7. Just 3 devotees lived there. And by the time the class was over and I was intoxicated by the banana milk that was served afterwards, they invited me to stay overnight, and I could go home the next day, and I just ended up staying. And that was my introduction to becoming a aspiring devotee.
That's amazing.
So I didn't really.
You covered a lot of territory. So just one point, if I may ask. So
Sure.
How was your interest in say film and that you had some family background, or you had some like innate attraction towards it, or how did that work out?
Well, I didn't really have family involved in film. I did have, my father was an inventor. He was an engineer, and he did during the 1930s and the 40s design and was a executive at a manufacturing company for 16 millimeter projectors. So he had certainly an interest in the engineering side of things, but my interest was in the creative side of things. So that was the extent of my experience and exposure to films. But during college, the window to the world was going to the theater and watching the art films from international sources. And I think that really sparked my interest during my undergraduate studies, to where I took an interest in going to film school for graduate studies.
So it's significant that among all the things that could have attracted you to Krishna, it was the picture of Krishna the painting which you found, so that also indicates your strong artistic inclination. So was that something which you were able to soon pursue, or it took some time for you to pursue that over further?
Well, let's just talk about pictures. I mean,
Okay.
of course, we know Prabhupada said that these paintings were pictures of the spiritual world, and the fact that a picture is worth 1,000 words really emphasizes the importance of visual arts in helping people understand their spiritual nature. And of course, Srila Prabhupada, really his love was the art department, and he knew the value of sharing these transcendental visions. So I really became a devotee without reading a thing, practically, except the Bhakti Godhead magazine. I didn't study the Bhagavad Gita we didn't have the CC in those days. We didn't even have access at that time to the Krishna book. So our reading material was very limited. The nectar of instruction we had, and of course we had Easy Journey to Other Planets, and just a very, very few other first canto, 1, 2, maybe 1 and part of 2 in those days. But I was not an intellectual. I became a devotee simply by the mercy of the spiritual master in Krishna.
This is it's, of course, we all come to a spiritual path to mercy, but it's amazing how the mercy comes in various formats, or various, you could say, various ways in which it comes. So in some ways you can say that, it was what was your swabhava, what was your, to some extent, your innate attraction, which also became your professional training. Krishna manifested his mercy through that area for you. And that is also a significant area of emphasis for Srila Prabhupada, that he did spend a good amount of time on training devotees and emphasizing that we have paintings. Even when the CC was produced in a marathon, Prabhupada said, okay, the paintings may not be of the highest quality, but still we should have paintings. He didn't cut corners on that. So it was quite important for Srila Prabhupada also to present the artistic aspect of Krishna Bhakti. So was that one of
our Radharani, also known as Shamarani,
yes,
she wrote one of the most important books, The Art of Spiritual Life, in which she describes in great detail Prabhupada's instructions to the artists. I've had many long conversations with her. In fact, I was working in the ISKCON press with her in New York in 1971, and understood what it meant to really surrender to Prabhupada's desires when it comes to illustrating transcendental pastimes. And I highly recommend that the devotees study this book, because I don't think enough emphasis has been given to the visual media since Prabhupada left. Certainly not the films, but with the exception of maybe Rameshwar and a few who understood Prabhupada's inner heart when it came to broadcasting the message of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu through artistic means, dioramas, paintings, film, theater. Prabhupada really was at the leading us like Pied Piper in a cultural revolution, and I think that's where we were most successful in attracting others in our festivals with dance, song, kirtan, artistic exhibits, etc. This really piqued the interest of the living entity, but more importantly, what it did was it created a reminder, because every living entity is familiar with Krishna, they've just forgotten. And really, it's our task and our honor to remind them. So that the visual arts are just essential for that purpose.
That's beautifully put. So actually, sometimes the word culture can have such a broad meaning that we may overlook the fact that culture ultimately is not just about mandating a particular kind of dress or prescribing or proscribing. It's more like you could say appeal to the sentient side, appeal to the heart. So cultural manifestations, they speak a language beyond we could say the rational. It's not that they're irrational, but they are like, you could say, almost transrational. So I believe that's, you are talking about culture in that sense. Isn't it something which speaks to the human heart through multitude of ways? It could be music, it could be art, it could be even cuisine, it could be dress, it could be so many things like that. Is that the broad sense in which you're using the word culture? Or when you say Prabhupada talked about culture being an important part of his presentation?
Well, first of all, I want to commend you for understanding that in order to communicate properly, we need to know we need to agree upon what we're talking about. Because as you noted, culture means different things to different people and in different circumstances. We talk about the culture of surrender. We talk about the culture of ISKCON. We talk about Indian culture, Western culture. Most of the time, we really don't know what culture is that we're talking about. And, I would add that culture gets mixed up with tradition. We have certain traditions in ISKCON, for example. We've only been existing for 50 some odd years. What do you mean tradition? Isn't tradition something that takes hundreds of years to establish? And does it necessarily mean that tradition, which intrinsically is a part of culture, is necessarily something good? We tend to we have the tradition of the indigenous people that we've destroyed. Well, yeah, headhunting was their tradition. Good thing it's no longer existing. So it's really, I really want to agree with you that the idea, what is culture? What constitutes it? And what are its different meanings? And I think that's a part of a hermeneutic approach. Again, hermeneutics, which has recently been introduced into ISKCON, is one of the greatest tools that we have for understanding Srila Prabhupada's intentions, style, and really his heart. So, I think that if we look at culture simply in terms of art and not necessarily tradition, we find that Srila Prabhupada was not much interested in the culture of behavior. He was interested in artistic culture and expressing Krishna consciousness through that means.
So actually I agree with you that unless we have a common platform when we're talking about culture. So I have had a long discussion with Nrsimhananda Maharaj, and he uses the culture to introduce people to Krishna consciousness, to Bhakti Yoga. And he has been quite successful in giving people experiences that they remember lifelong. Oh, I went there and danced. I dressed like this. I had, especially when I wore those gopi dots, and we did so many things. We ate this food. So it seems that there is a significant level of cultural curiosity in the world today, but sometimes we as a movement don't leave a sufficient distance between, say, cultural curiosity and cultural conformity. That means, as you have to adopt. This is what we do. Yeah, I want to know what you do, but this is what you have to do to practice bhakti. I think that is where the hesitation comes up. But our culture, there is this in the multicultural world today, there is a lot of eagerness to know and even appreciate other people's cultures. But to adopt it wholesale, that is where the same thing which could be our strength sometimes becomes our weakness, even our Achilles heel sometimes. It sometimes makes us come off as too sectarian. So I believe when you are talking about culture, you're talking about, say, the medium of visual depictions through which we can attract people. Of course, that's one aspect. You will have a broader meaning, but please go ahead, Ravi.
No, I agree very strongly with you. Culture is a two-sided sword. It can really cut deeply and divide. That same sword that can bring us cut the knots of attachment and bring us together can also bring us apart. So your point about culture is very well taken, and probably would be the subject of a very long discussion, because you have the Krishna West point of view, which is championed by Hridayananda Maharaj, which is, the dress, the food, this, that, it's not all that important. You have others who say, no, this is what Prabhupada wanted us to exploit and to dive into, and to, these are dresses from the spiritual world. And I think, okay, a dhoti is from the spiritual world, a sari is from the spiritual world, but what about my kurta? Do they have buttons in the spiritual world like this kurta? Do they have long sleeves, short sleeve? Do they have, is it sewn, not sewn? You start to get into the nitty gritty of what's culture. It becomes very confusing. And it leaves in many ways, it divides us. So
yes,
I'm not very keen on cultural. Then the GBC comes up with this resolution to try to resolve everything, or try to make everything work, called cultural sensitivity. We have to be culturally sensitive. But what is that? Who's defining that culture? A few people on the IB, are they defining the culture?
That's a tough thing, yes.
I've lived in India, traveled in India. India is not a monolith. It's completely open to information from all over the world. Cultures, there's many cultures there. I just don't buy into the one world view of it's all this way here.
That is true. Even in India, we might stereotype Western culture, but when you talk about Western culture, you could say that to a significant extent, the culture of, say, New York is quite different from the culture of, say, Florida, and it's in America also there are significant divides. So it becomes complicated. But I was reading one Christian book about culture. So they gave a very interesting definition, which seemed that, just like in biology, they have the word bacteria culture or yeast culture. So the idea is, what they use is that which a culture is an environment in which that particular organism flourishes. So it's in microbiology, bacteria culture means where bacteria will flourish. We create that culture. So they said that that in today's world, what is there something like a Christian culture? So he said that in the Bible, there is just the mention that God should be glorified, but there's no mention of what music, what song, no specific prescription. You can do it in your own way. So the idea is that they said that as long as your devotion to God is flourishing, that is the culture that you can adopt. Now, that could be a very inclusive way of looking at it. And culture could be a very, as you said, a big topic for discussion. But as our movement is spreading, it does seem that we will need to recognize that we as a movement can't be constantly against the mainstream culture. Because, we are not fighting for the mainstream culture. We're not fighting against the mainstream culture. Ultimately, we are fighting to, if at all we want to use a fighting metaphor, our purpose is to share bhakti, to help people grow spiritually. So some people may go anti-mainstream in their practice of bhakti, and some people may be pro-mainstream. Now, whatever is the mainstream is also quite difficult to define. But, but okay, whatever is considered mainstream in society. But to some extent, maybe there are certain things which are just left to people wherever they are. These are the principles of bhakti, and you practice it the way you want it. Like Prabhupada had this Govindam Adi Purusham. It's a very traditional Brahma Samhita song in Sanskrit, but it's accompanied with music and a voice which is quite Western and contemporary. So that our morning Aarti itself is a good example of the focus being on the glorification of Krishna, whatever be the specific forms that are taken for that purpose of glorification. Any thoughts on this, Prabhu?
Yes, a lot of thoughts. You can do a quote war, and you can find what Prabhupada said about establishing Indian culture, throughout his writings, his Vani. But that ultimately doesn't really achieve the goal, which is to become a lover of God, which is what really Srila Prabhupada, his overarching principle was, however you can do it, in whatever discipline that you find, you should do that. So the demagogue approach has really divided us enormously. And for myself, my own experience and the experience of many, particularly in the West, we didn't come to Krishna consciousness through the logician's path. I didn't have to read a thing. It was all kripa. It was all mercy. And I think to a great degree, as we study and people, absorb Srila Prabhupada's instructions, and we begin to cherry pick from his books, and then we start to prioritize what's more important: the book, the lecture, the conversation, the letter, and we start to give, a certain priority to it. We lose the very thing that brought us in the first place, which was an aha moment, a deep realization, a gift from the spiritual master, which is ineffable. You can't really categorize it. You can't put it in a box. And, that's what our brains tend to do. Our brains, especially male brains, we tend to compartmentalize everything. And, female brains are a little more, their wiring is much more complicated, so to speak. But we try to simplify things and bring logic to it. And it doesn't work too well in spiritual life. That's what I've seen over these last 50 plus years. So I have a lot of empathy for those that, rely on just looking at certain statements of Srila Prabhupada and making conclusions based on them. But ultimately, I think that there's a feeling that we have to have for a sentiment that is perhaps in many ways more important than the philosophy. I know the old saying, philosophy without religion is mental speculation, and religion without philosophy is just sentimental. But I would say that if I were having to judge which one has a little more weight, I would say that the sentimentality really, when one feels for Krishna consciousness, feels love or attachment or affection, and that's the beauty of art, because art evokes emotion, and emotionally we are spiritual. They're just covered by material emotions. So the power of a picture, the power of a story, the power of a visual narrative called movies, that resonates very deeply and has a very good opportunity for touching the heart, not changing the heart, but touching the heart, softening the heart. I remember this one story about Bhakti Siddhanta when he was, Saraswati, when he was taking his disciples in Puri. And they passed lepers and nobody gave anything to them. And so Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati, he stopped them. He said, why no one gave a paisa to these poor lepers? And they all quoted the Bhagavad Gita, verses on charity, the mode of goodness, passion, and ignorance. And Bhakti Siddhanta said, so who is their father? Oh, Krishna is their father. And who is your father? Oh, Krishna is our father. So what does that make you? Makes us brothers, sisters. And so Bhaktisiddhanta says, so if you don't give to your brother and your sister some charity, what happens to your heart? And he said, it becomes hard. And if your heart becomes hard, then how can Krishna stay there? So this story had a big impact on me, because Prabhupada was like that. You know, he ultimately, if people left, if they performed some sinful activities, so many different things, Prabhupada was always forgiving, always, you know, the rules were always secondary to his sentiment, his love. And I think to a great degree, we've forgotten that that's really why we joined. We joined because Krishna consciousness is a celebration of togetherness, of unity of purpose, of brotherhood, sisterhood. And it's what attracted me in the beginning, and it's what sustains me today. Not all devotees I'm friendly with, nor do I want to be friendly with. There's devotees in the mode of goodness and passionate ignorance, you know, and everywhere in between. And there are only a few of them are my friends. I mean, my deep friends that I can feel safe with and share things with. You know, I pick and choose them according to, you know, whether I can feel that they love me. And so I think that that's really, to me, it ultimately Krishna consciousness and the pursuit of Krishna consciousness is done with love and devotion, not just discipline and not just adherence to the rules. The rules are secondary to the principle of loving exchanges. And I know it gets messy. I know it becomes fraught with controversy. But to me, that trumps every other aspect of devotional life.
That's so important, you know, what you said. I mean, so many thoughts that the first thing you said is that, you know, not many of us came by the logician's path. Although the philosophy was one thing that attracted, but the kind of aha moment, it doesn't come just because of the philosophy. It could be the philosophy provides great insight, but there is some kind of, it's almost something which is not so easily even articulable in words. What actually attracts a person? It's like, what convinced me, if somebody asks, you know, there are multitude of factors, but you can't reduce it simply to something which can be so easily explained in terms of logic. And we need to extend that opportunity to others also. So with respect to art, now the last point which you mentioned, it took me some years also to realize that like-minded association is so important in bhakti. Now, I always had a very analytical kind of mind. I would ask a lot of questions. And the kind of questions I would ask would make many devotees, even devotee leaders, uncomfortable. Because they were little probing questions. And till I found a group of devotees who were actually comfortable with deeper questions, I felt that I was being suppressed. So, like what you said, that sajati asha, or that what Rupa Goswami also says, that we need like-minded association. That's quite important. And maybe, you know, we could move this culture aspect you talked about to the interaction between devotees. Because in one sense, there could be many different aspects about culture. But the one thing that people notice when they are exploring a particular community or a particular group is, how do you treat each other? You know, how do you deal with each other? So if within a group itself, there are a lot of bitterness and a lot of mutual acerbic feelings, and especially public invectives against each other, then they say, you know, okay, whatever, how good your philosophy is, I don't want to get involved in the group like this. So it's significant that in the sixfold loving exchanges among devotees, it's there is, when Rupa Goswami talks about it, he doesn't really directly bring in Krishna over there. He says that you sing about Krishna, you hear about Krishna, that is of course there, but what he talks about is you give gifts to each other, you know, you share prasad with each other, and then mostly share your heart with each other. So maybe that is, we could discuss various aspects of culture. But if you like, since we also want to discuss about the Sabha, would you like to go in this direction about the way we interact with each other and the way we interact with between between different layers of leadership in the movement and the leaders and the members? Would that also broadly come in an important aspect of what people will consider as culture?
It's interesting that you bring that up. So let me introduce the SABHA to those who don't know what it is. It is the Spiritual Advisory Bhagavat Assembly. That's a big name. But really what it is just an advisory group. And it follows in the principle of what Prabhupada had established in 1976 when he was disgusted with the GBC. He said that everything that had to was passed by the GBC had to be reviewed by the temple presidents in Mayapur, and they could then send anything back to the GBC with their comments for further review. And so that happened for 2 years. Of course, Prabhupada left in 1977. It was quickly abandoned. I'm not sure which year, but very quickly. And then it was forgotten until the 2014-15, when Kunteya and the strategic planning team, ORGDEV, realized that really there was no reflective group for the GBC itself, for their own. There was no assessments. They didn't have an opportunity to have completed that, that instruction from Prabhupada to have a peer review. So they put together legislation called the SABHA that would be partly from zones around the world, from ministries, from senior devotees, from sannyasis and gurus, and that group would then be elected by the various ministries and by the SGGS, nominated and elected, and then form a council or an advisory group that would review all resolutions, and then they would send them back with any thoughts if they felt that they were not fully developed or had some problems. And somehow or another, I was nominated and then elected chairman of that group, which meant that we had to really start from scratch. We had to, form WhatsApp groups and figure out how we were going to discuss things on something like some platform. We picked Freeform, and we didn't know each other, The main focus that I had, we have to establish some sense of cohesiveness, of purpose amongst each other.
Okay. And sorry, if you don't mind, if I may, just let me go back. It's a lot of territory. So I remember reading in 1976 about is this the same time when there were differences between the Grahasthas and the Sannyasis, or that was a different issue? Because I didn't know that Prabhupada made a categorical resolution that what the GBC say should be reviewed by the temple presidents. That is like a categorical statement he made, because that is a very strong indication of having some kind of check and balance. Because that is one of the concerns that, is there a system of check and balance within our movement? So Prabhupada already made some kind of provision for that. So what the temple president's body meant to be advisory, or was it like something mandatory, or what was the nature of that Prabhupada's directive basically?
It was purely advisory, but no resolution would be, if in effect, without the temple presidents reviewing them and having the right to send them back for further review and consideration with their ideas. So, yes, Prabhupada was not happy with the GBC. He wanted to dissolve the GBC, in fact. But he came up with this. Yeah, he was just very angry with the way in which the managers were doing things. Very disappointed, not angry.
Was there any specific reason, or that there means?
Yes, there were. I would have to pull out that file in my brain to.
Okay. No, so
research.
basically, he just felt that there has to be more like a dialogue between the devotee community, devotee leaders, and the devotee body community before decisions are made. Because I know another occasion when the GBC tried to centralize all finances, and Prabhupada had suspended the GBC temporarily, and he said the temple presidents directly correspond with me. So was this also broadly something about too much centralization, and Prabhupada wanted to avoid that? Or, I mean, without the specific issues, what was the broad reason Prabhupada felt in that something like this was necessary?
I think you have to see it as a cumulative. I mean, Srila Prabhupada was disappointed in his GBCs over time and wanted there to be a check and balance.
Okay.
So he established this temple presidents meeting. And it was a very important part of the Mayapur festival that they had the opportunity to review the resolutions and send them back. There was a resentment in amongst the GBCs that Srila Prabhupada had this new body to look over their shoulders, because people like authority. They just, rebel in authority. I don't know. It seems to be a human foible that the more power you get, or perceived power you get, the more you want to hold on to it as in an exclusive way.
Yeah. Another thing is that I have been having on my podcast devotees who also studied Gaudiya history a little bit. So one thing that came up with that it is not just simply that when Bhaktisiddhanta Thakur wanted to establish something like the GBC, it was not just that the devotees in the Gaudiya Math were rebellious. It is the traditional idea that they thought was that each matha and the matha has a mathadipati. So in one sense, the Guru's authority is to some extent absolute. Not entirely absolute, but how the Guru would function within a cooperative body, that itself was a challenge conceptually and logistically, how to execute it. So that could also be a concern. There's a part of us which naturally wants power and control, but another aspect would also be that Prabhupada doesn't talk so much about ISKCON's managerial system in his books. In his books, he's talking about obeying the spiritual master, and often the spiritual master is seen as a absolute authority. So if people have that conception, both from the spiritual master's perspective and the disciple's perspective, then a body that holds the leaders accountable, that may be a little difficult to conceptually also calibrate within how we think Krishna consciousness works. In the past, we could say whenever the spiritual culture was there in India, people in general knew about spirituality. And if now maybe everybody know the philosophy, but at least broadly, there was a broad understanding of what spirituality was and how it was to be practiced. So in today's world, when people don't know about it, many people just don't have any idea of what spirituality means. And then we have the idea that absolute surrender to a particular authority, then that can itself become problematic. So if I understand right, SABHA is so the name could be new, but Prabhupada, you could say, seeded it by his wanting to have a body for oversight. And so was this meant to be all temple presidents at that time, or some temple presidents? Because now I believe we might be having several hundred temple presidents now. So the SABHA, is not exactly a temple president's body now, but that principle is being carried on. Is that right now, the way I understand it?
What was the principle? The principle was representative of the devotees worldwide. So they came up, the OrgDev came up with this formula of membership in the SABHA. And my job as the chairman, I felt, was first to establish a family, a sense of unity of purpose. And that's what we set out to do in the beginning, to first of all get to know each other, and then based on certain not just reviewing resolutions, but being concerned about certain deficiencies within the society, we could come together, discuss them, create proposals. That was part of our mandate, that we could, without needing a GBC sponsor, we could have proposals that would then be submitted to the GBC for discussion and vote. And there were certain commonalities of interest amongst the 25 or so at that time. We have 33 members now out of the 35 that is our full membership. We got very enthusiastic to be behind some proposals, especially in regards to the books, the changes in the books. That was a very big bite out of the apple that we took in the beginning. It brought us together because we brought in many different points of view and then discussed them at great length. One of the advantages of a group like the SABHA is that we have time. We take the time. We're a deliberative body, and we can bring in various devotees who are expert in various issues to give us information, and then we take further time. We even have a rule now that we created that whenever someone calls for a vote, there's a 72-hour period before that survey is given, and anyone within that 72-hour period can, if they're not satisfied with the discussion, can call for an extension, so that various other issues swirling around that can be hopefully discussed and resolved. So we've taken it. We took that up in a spirit of a family spirit. I'll tell you, it's really fun to be a part of a group where you feel it's one for all and all for one. There's mutual respect. There's a good sense of listening. We understand that participation may come in various numbers in terms of some people are less prone to participate than others, but we call upon various members to speak if they haven't spoken up, because that's just how the dynamics are of meetings. There'll be just a few people who will speak and everyone else remains silent. If anyone's been to a GBC meeting, they see how that works. And it's the job of the chairman to engage everybody and to make everyone's voice feel like it's been heard. So we've really been fortunate. I think we also got some amendments passed from our mandate so that we could appoint temporary members and not have to wait for months, if not years, to replace members. We're operating at full steam. I've never experienced a more cooperative and loving group than I have with even our Indian members, and one of them's a member of the IB. Everybody has respect for each other's positions and thoughts. It's just a wonderful, and what we do is, if someone wants to bring up a topic, they become the moderator of that topic, both online and when we discuss it. We also we have breakout groups. So instead of meeting every week, the breakout groups meet every other week, and then they report to the group. So you have a group of maybe 5, 6, much more manageable number. They do the research. They come back to the body with their research. Then the body discusses it. We've developed various methodologies that are inclusive. And I think that anyone who's on the SABHA will say that they really look forward to the meetings. I'm not so sure all the GBC, in fact, I'm sure many of the GBCs do not look forward to the meeting, but we do because of the Sangha. We established a web page. Devotees can contact us through that web page, ISKCON.SABHA.com. ISKCONSABHA.com. There's no dot between it. And we have a resource page there, which allows devotees to find where they can get help in different areas or questions asked. It's just been a great ride so far, these last 4 years. And we've actually been the cause of a couple of GBC resolutions being rescinded after, battling it for quite some time. But We've had an effect in that way. We feel very privileged to be on the GBC, in the GBC meetings. One representative is at the meeting online, and 3 representatives are at the meetings in Mayapur. So I think the SABHA augurs well for the future as the GBC complexion changes. I think there'll be more reliance on the SABHA as a advisory group. At first, of course, they had a great trepidation about whether or not we're going to step on their lotus toes. But, I think we've been careful and respectful, and we really want the GBC to succeed, because without their success, these international organization falls apart. And, sannyasis will have a much more difficult time preaching and going from one place to another. It's very important for the cohesiveness of our movement that we have a successful GBC. And we're trying to do what we can to make that happen.
Oh, okay. This is such an important point. So it's not so much, even if there is some kind of check and balance and criticism also, the point is every organization will need some managerial structure, and we need the body that is going to manage the managerial structure to be successful. Otherwise, our core mission of doing, as you said, sannyasis doing preaching and outreach, that itself will be impeded. So ultimately, the purpose is cooperative and synergistic.
Yes, definitely. We're very much in favor of a healthy GBC, and people looking to them for example. And it's been a journey of these decades through the period of zonal Acarya, and then Guru Tattva issues, and just various. It's a big world. It's not easy to keep it all together, but we can do it. We can do it, and we're hoping for the best. And we're seeing some new members come on the GBC who are extraordinarily qualified. So we're hoping to see that things kind of become more, people develop more faith and hope in a successful organization where everybody feels that they have a voice and that they're respected.
Yeah, that is 2 things which you said, that many devotees who are not a part of the managerial structure, they often feel that they don't have any voice at all. That that their concerns are not even heard or cared for, and that can be a problem, because on one side it could be that the managers are also loaded with a lot of responsibilities and they have to get things done, and Prabhupada also had that mood of achieving things for Krishna. So if somebody is constantly finding faults with somebody who is trying to achieve things for Krishna, at one time and one level, they may also get annoyed, and they may have valid reasons to feel annoyed. But another level, so there could be like too much oversight, but another point, there could be too little oversight also, where in trying to do things for Krishna, we get more caught in the things than the Krishna element. So Krishna element can sometimes just become cosmetic, and then we are doing things which just increase maybe our own prestige within the devotee movement, or our own conceptions of what we want to achieve in the movement. So that balance is difficult to have. So is this sabha going to be something which you expect to become a part of the ISKCON culture at various levels? That means, say, in a temple, we have the temple president and other body, temple president and usual temple council. So do we expect to have some kind of sabha at the level of each temple also in future, so that there can be more voice and participation for everyone? Or what is or at this stage, first you would like this to be a working template and then think of replication at other levels?
Well, of course, that's there with what's, generally termed as the temple board. They are supposed to perform that function, because the temple president is, managing the day-to-day activities of a temple. A visionary temple president has a little more. He takes on a greater burden because he's looking how do I extend the preaching from the temple, not just managing the temple itself. And that really depends on the qualities of the individuals. I mean, here in Los Angeles, in Dorca, there's no ISKCON. There's no the interaction with the temple president is just on a personal basis, and he makes all the final decisions. He's really it's really just a one-man authority. Other temples have ISKCON all the time. They have temple boards. And to some degree, we're stuck with that system of where that Prabhupada gave a lot of emphasis to the autonomy of temples. Didn't want the temples being either managed from certainly the GBC level or really micromanaged at all. Basically, you sink or swim based on your managerial and spiritual skills. So it's a balance that's going to always be, dynamic. Some places, if you don't like some places, start your own. It's kind of like, which side do you want to lean on? The side of being more free and having temples not be at the beck and call of a distant authority, but at the same time there's a danger in that? Or do you want to have a temple that's constantly which is individuating and unique and takes its own style in the way in which it preaches? I'll always go for the creative approach, the approach that has more freedom. Yes, it's like democracy. Democracy is very messy. The GBC is a democracy, by the way. A 51% vote makes the decision. That's the way Srila Prabhupada set it up. So, it's not that, sometimes we say, democracies are demon crazy and this and that, but, in some ways, that's what Prabhupada appreciated.
This is one of the concerns. Sometimes we just take isolated sound bites from what Prabhupada had spoken and don't consider the overall context or the overall impact.
Yeah.
So even I've been studying Chanakya's works a little bit and a little bit of the traditional Indian systems of management. So even when there was a king, the king had an advisory board like ministers and brahmanas, and they would sometimes work by democracy also. Like they would have not necessarily the formal system of voting, but they would try to, they would have different opinions. And then the king was not a person who had like arbitrary or absolute authority. So in that sense, democracy is also not unprecedented within our tradition. But
it's interesting because the founding fathers of America, they created what everyone understands as a democratic country. But the democracy what they felt was the democracy depended upon intelligent voters, its constituents. So, for example, women didn't get the vote. Slaves didn't get the vote. You had to own land to be able to vote. They assumed that if you owned land, you had a certain level of intelligence. So there's also that consideration in the politics of democracy that, if everybody votes, you get the lowest common denominator of everything, which doesn't serve the body too well. It may be better than the alternative, than tyranny, but there are certainly problems with the democratic institutions. And I'm sure that that's the case even within the GBC, that there's a certain downside to it because, but the beauty is that when you have very intelligent people on that GBC, and we do, that intelligence often comes through and is recognized by others and is adopted as it's just that there's a culture there that is shaped by being GBC for life. And I'm not certain that Prabhupada wouldn't have changed that given the conditions of the past few days, seen the evidence of the past few decades. I don't think that that's I don't think that that's etched in stone. and because it doesn't seem to be a very effective way of governing when you're not either accountable by some assessments or you have an open-ended lifetime membership. It doesn't seem to work too well. And Prabhupada was always changing things around in terms of, he wasn't changing the philosophy, but the application. He was constantly adapting.
That is true. And the very fact that like he had, for example, different stands on whether he would be personally involved in marrying devotees or not. And like you said, he had a GBC, but then he created something more. So it does seem that with respect to Sambandha Gyan, the philosophical knowledge, he was quite clear, but with respect to the Abhideya, the setting up of systems by which people will be able to remember Krishna, or we have a system that aids people remembering Krishna, Prabhupada was quite, we could say, resourceful in terms of what he was founding when he was pragmatic. So this is an interesting point that that lifelong membership. So did Prabhupada, did the subject ever came up of even temple presidents also? Like once a person is appointed, it's for life unless there is some very, very scandalous or outrageous thing that comes up, or that person voluntarily chooses to resign, or of course that person departs from the world. So the idea that for life, are you saying that something like having a tenure would work better than for life? Or what
absolutely. A definition of terms, reassessments. I think all these things would do a world of good for any part of our society, whether it's in the temple management or in the GBC. We're working on it in the SABHA. We're working on a self-assessment process. We're going through right now. We're voting on initiating something amongst ourselves so we can see how it works. And eventually, when we find a good balance, we'll make a proposal for the GBC to adopt a similar system. But we want to be the guinea pigs before and see what the subtleties are to being able to look in the mirror individually and as a group. And we take also lessons. We've got people involved. We find experts, like, for example, Yudhisthira from Dallas. He's very successful. He was the Dallas Temple president for many years, and he also has a successful business in Dallas. And his expertise is he's volunteering to the SABHA to help us. And we choose other individuals that are knowledgeable in these fields, so we're not reinventing the wheel all the time, which I think is a complete waste of time.
In what context are you talking about reinventing the wheel? That means something has worked somewhere and we try to replicate it at other places, or reinventing the wheel?
Why should we be experimenting with our speculations on what good management practices are when there's schools that you can get graduate degrees in these subjects? So why not bring in somebody who's an expert? And it's like bringing in a lawyer. Have him come tell us, what do we need to do? When the Global Healthcare Committee was passed, the resolution was passed, nobody thought of the legal implications of the GBC taking on such an enormous responsibility and liabilities. And it took many, many months, not only recommending various managerial improvements to that resolution, which was really just threadbare, did not offer much, but also putting it into the arena of legal liability woke up the GBC to what they'd done. They hadn't thought about it, and they eventually rescinded that resolution. Not that a global health care group of devotees, a Bhaktivedanta Medical Association or something cannot go forward. Certainly it can. But to do so under the banner of ISKCON would be very risky. So it's just like they had to bring in lawyers to explain, not just lawyers, but even the ISKCON legal counsel, the Bhaktinand, had to call upon lawyers who are specialists in the healthcare industry to give their opinions, to opine on this issue. And I think that, the GBC listens very carefully to lawyers, strikes fear in the heart. You get really serious when you hear from a lawyer, just like from a doctor.
That's true. So it's interesting when you talk about expertise that there are some devotees who may feel that we should look for, not say like Western academically educated models for management. We should look for traditional Vedic models of management. But what source we may take, that be something which can be discussed. But the fact is that to function in the world with all its challenges, expertise is required. And to get expert inputs, and especially like you talk about law or medicine, if we are living in the contemporary environment, we can't say claim immunity from contemporary legal systems or contemporary medical challenges just by claiming that we are a part of a tradition. We will have to deal with those issues. So to some extent, even if we want to adopt a traditional model for management, still it will have to interact with the contemporary world. And in that sense, somebody expert in the contemporary way of functioning in the world would be helpful.
The example is there when Srila Prabhupada's last trip to London, and he was in such pain because he had blockage for his bladder. And, he had to have surgery. And he was very grateful for that doctor for having relieved him of what was really a death sentence at that time. And, we just have to not be fanatics about, you should just listen to Ayurvedic types of treatment. Well, it's whatever works. And that was Prabhupada's great contribution that he gave to us, that we had this yukta vairagya, that we were able to renounce those things that were not favorable for devotional service and engage those things that are. And, that just takes a very common sense approach to practicing Krishna consciousness wherever we are in the world.
Okay. Common sense, yeah. There's one thing which I have also encountered.
As they say, common sense is not so common.
Yeah. Just before this podcast, I had a podcast with Mahatma Prabhu, and he told me that Prabhupada would, on many occasions, talk about common sense. That's just common sense. You have to adopt that. So sometimes in the name of, say, surrender to Guru or faithfulness to Shastra, we may downplay the role of common sense. So yeah, functioning in the particular part of the world. Even we could say Prabhupada's deciding to spend a lot of time in India because, say, many of his Western disciples found it difficult to deal with Indians who presumed that Western people had a lot of money and he could get a lot of money from them. That is also, Prabhupada left Western outreach to his Western disciples, and he focused his energy on India. Because that was also, you could say there's some aspect of common sense in it, that, this is what he had lived in India and he could do this well, and his Western disciples could do the West well. So common sense also has a significant role. Yeah, I agree with you fully.
So he comes to the West, and Krishna arranges that, this kind of tattered band of hippies and nonconformists, are somehow enlightened. But not only are they enlightened, he brings them to India, and they are put in charge, women and men are put in charge of putting together festivals, whether it's in Surat or in Kolkata and other places, and preaching and really inspiring the very same Indians that couldn't hear Prabhupada, could hear it from these Western devotees.
Mm-hmm.
Were it not for the so-called uncultured malechas out of the West, nobody in India would be arguing the points of administration or philosophy in Krishna consciousness, because it never would have come to anybody's attention. the fact is that the Western devotees, for all of their faults and their filthy habits and the rest of it, were able to communicate the essential message of Krishna consciousness and ignite that spark that was, became a fire in India.
In general, what I found is that I was born and brought up in India. I was introduced to Krishna consciousness in India. And the first 10 to 12 years I spent in India traveling, especially doing youth preaching. And the last decade, more or less, I've been spending outside India. And mainly in the West. Before the pandemic, almost 9 months a year, 9 to 10 months, I was outside India. And primarily in West America, Canada, UK, New Zealand, Australia. So two things struck me, Prabhu, that there's a remarkable amount of similarity in the devotee communities across the world, whether they're Indians or Western. There are differences, no doubt. No doubt there are differences. But there is a large amount of similarities. And Vrajabihari Prabhu had told me that sometimes when conflicts occur, it is like usually the 5% or 10%, those who are the extreme polarities, they have the loudest voices. And then the Indian Yatra gets essentialized to some 5%, 10% extreme voices. And the Western Yatra gets essentialized or reduced to that 5%, 10%. And the polarization happens because of that to some extent. So as far as I can see, most devotees in the Indian temples, now for them, they just want to practice bhakti and move on with their lives, move on with their daily lives and their spiritual lives. So the issues that divide at a particular levels of ISKCON management, ISKCON leadership may not be that divisive at the ground level. That's one aspect. And so in that sense, I would say that Indians, to say that Indians disrespect or want to distance themselves from the West, maybe that's not the feeling among everybody in India, in the devotee community. Some part of the devotee community who happen to be the loudest voices. Now, I'm not disrespecting those who have those opinions over here. I'm just pointing out that there's no opinion poll done in the Indian ISKCON community to say, do we feel that do the Indian devotees feel that the Western devotees are not actually devotees, or they're not properly practicing the culture or representing that? And I would say something similar would apply even if we took an opinion poll in the West about what they think about Indians. So again, that what you talk about, the one of the purpose of SABHA to have internal communication. I think an internal amount of communication is required everywhere between we could say the leaders and their constituents at whatever level they might be. So that was one point. And second point about, do you want to respond to that or speak something before I go to the second point?
Oh, no, I think you expressed my view perfectly, that there's a misrepresentation. I've traveled all over India, especially in the last few years, stayed there for long periods of time. And I found that the rank and file could care less about these heady issues, these defining of this word in Sanskrit means this and that. They're like us in the West. It's simple. Krishna consciousness is simple for the simple, complicated for the complicated. Yes, and I think the greatest enemy to our Krishna consciousness is self-righteousness. When we think we're right and somebody else is wrong, and we fight with like cats and dogs, that our vision must be the only vision. We asked our members on the SABHA, do you believe the GBC has compromised on the issue of the Vaishnavi Diksha Guru? Do you believe that? And their position is that there is no compromise with Shastra. Not all of them felt that way, but the majority did. That there's no compromise with Shastra. And, I found that for myself somewhat disingenuous because the Shastra is interpreted by each mentality, how we see things in context, how we look at not only that, but How we are in the matter, what's our level of advancement is part of the hermeneutic approach. You have to, do a somewhat objective self-assessment where you're how much are you able to understand yourself? Where's your level of advancement? Do you relish the holy name and chanting, or is it just a duty? There's so many aspects that you can look at in your own life to see whether or not you're very advanced on this path. So I agree with everything you said, everything. And I only wish that was broadcast more widely.
Yeah. Now, of course, I mean, I would hesitate to use the word misrepresentation, if I may say so. That it's just that it seems like there might be a deliberate manipulation. It could also be that the top leadership have concerns which they feel they are being far-sighted, and they're considering the wrong perspective, and that is not a responsibility of the average devotees to consider. So in general, I mean, what I've found is that if somebody is acting in a way that doesn't we find it very unreasonable, it is quite often I find it's better to start with ignorance or incompetence as an explanation rather than malevolence, that somebody is motivated wrongly. That could also be a possibility. But it's quite often that just the world has become so complex now that the ground realities of India and the ground realities of the West are so different. Now, I used to go to a regular temple I used to visit a temple in India very regularly. And they told me that they've built a very big temple. And they told that they used to have Bhagavatam classes in English. And they have started having classes in Hindi and and the local state they are in that language. Because they felt that the local community in India felt that we as a ISKCON temple are not Indian enough because our classes are in English. So we don't include. Then they started having classes in Hindi. Then they said that, okay, you are having Hindi, but we are in a particular state. The people of this particular state don't feel included. So you have to have classes in your local community, local language also. So if we can have devotees needing to adapt to the diversity in India itself, then what to speak of the diversity outside India and devotees needing space to adapt themselves. So what you are saying about SABHA leading to a little bit of more dialogue in a friendly environment, there's mutual understanding. In my small understanding, that's a big step forward. If that leads to, it's that, we are dealing with such different worlds that, and people come with such different values, not values in the sense of spiritual values, but social values, cultural values, interpersonal values, that we need to recognize that as a movement, to be relevant, to connect with the people at particular places, a certain amount of freedom is required and needs to be given. So even Bhakti Purushottam Maharaj is doing a lot of outreach to the tribal community in India. And it's interesting, when they had the tribal community started telling them to wear dhoti kurta and sari and other things like that. So some of the local politicians complained that, these Hare Krishnas are just like Christian missionaries. When they can convert, these tribal people lose their tribal culture. So now, even in doing the tribal outreach, they're saying you can wear your own dress, you can wear your own musical instrument, but just chant Hare Krishna and practice Bhakti. So even within India, there is the recognition that if we want to do effective outreach, we need to be aware of what the concerns of the local people are and address those concerns effectively. Yes.
It's just common sense. That's what you do.
Common sense is a good way of putting it. Yes, true.
And what we've discovered in SABHA as a group is that there's a higher principle that Srila Prabhupada gave to us that we have to keep as our guiding star, and that is that our love for Prabhupada will be shown by how we cooperate together. And that that if we can, if, for example, the ICC had a straw vote that they, don't want to follow the GBC. Okay, it didn't have any executive power, but just the idea that they would take that vote shows that there's a misunderstanding of what does Prabhupada really want for all of us. More than anything, he wants his mission to be working together, cooperating together. And I think if we lose sight of that as our goal, then we will definitely disintegrate, because there's just too many fractures in the body to be able to mend them all, unless we're all operating under that overarching principle. And if there's anything, I hope that the SABHA can leave, and not just leave, but to cultivate, it's that mood that we have to cooperate together. And we have a very nice cooperation despite differences of opinions, we all realize that Prabhupada gave us a system of voting and a majority rule, and we'll abide by it and move on. Not get stuck and try to make our view turn the clock back and to spend inordinate amount of time regurgitating the same subject as we've done with the Vaishnava Diksha Guru issue. It's just such a waste of our energies when people all over the world need to get Krishna consciousness, become exposed. Because remember, the broadcasting of Krishna consciousness and the adoption of it is a numbers game. The idea is to get the message out to as many souls as possible, because out of 1,000 people who are exposed, maybe 10 will take a book, maybe 100, but maybe 10 will take a book. And out of the 10 that take a book, maybe one will become a devotee. So our job is to get the message out to as many people as possible, the pictures and the words. And really everything else is secondary. And that's why film is such a great medium, because it has the potential to be seen through the internet, certainly in theaters, by tens, if not hundreds of millions of people. But unfortunately, we haven't really done much in that arena. As much as we did with ITV, it was mainly internal. And yes, it was useful. And yes, people who came to our temples and sat down and watched the various documentaries and programs were enthused. But really to do something big is my ambition. I really am working with my godbrother Janardradhi, and we have a company that we put together in Mumbai to make Krishna conscious movies that are seen by masses of people. That's really my ambition. And I'm going to be pursuing that again when I'm no longer the chairman as of June. I'll be putting my energies back into producing movies.
That's wonderful. So in one sense, what you're doing is creating trans-institutional forms of outreach to connect with the devotee community and the broader community also, and bring people together. Am I understanding it? Actually, what these various forums which are there beyond like ITV and other things?
Well, my heart has always been in bringing people, exposing people to Krishna consciousness, as many people as possible. I mean, the internet is a dream, a wonderful way to get the message out. But, emotions are what move people.
Yes.
You have to touch their hearts. And the most effective way of touching people's hearts, other than prasadam, of course, is narratives, stories. Krishna book is all stories. That's what touches our heart. The rest of it is mainly, although there are many stories in the Bhagavatam, mainly it's those stories that give us a flavor, a taste, some little bit of ras, and that's really what makes us want more. And Krishna gives every devotee, a little taste in the beginning, one drop of nectar. And do we spend the rest of our life chasing after that drop? Because it's just so much better than anything we've experienced in the material world. And that's what we want to give people. That's at least my goal, is to, whether it's a taste of the nectar of devotee sangha, of real wonderful sangha where you really feel the spiritual connection with somebody, or whether it's giving it and broadcasting it through the distribution of Prabhupada's literatures where the potential is there for people to have that experience, or through films or through art. We want to give people a taste, because once you have that taste, you never want to give it up.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. Vishwanath Chakravarti in one of his commentaries says that the greatest need in human society is to give people an experience of higher taste. So there could be, and one of the things which I find is that when we get too caught up in, not that it's bad, but we get too caught up in internal institutional issues, then the idea of not just giving higher taste to others, but also focusing on that higher taste ourselves can very easily get lost, where we get caught in small issues and we overlook the big picture. So you're working on multiple tracks in that sense. While the SABHA is there, but you also have that broader vision of taking things forward to a bigger, to the broader community.
Well, I don't think anyone becomes a devotee unless they or at least remains a devotee, unless they feel cared for in some way by some other devotees. How can you want to be in a place you're not wanted? You have to feel wanted. You have to feel invited. And it's very difficult to sustain Krishna consciousness in an antiseptic environment. We have to feel the love, and it has to be, really sincere, not just, the superficial, hey, I love you. Yeah, right. But love is expressed through service. So, when you serve others in a loving manner, it's just an unforgettable experience, and it gives people a taste of the nectar for which we're always anxious. So, I hope that I haven't said anything that can be construed as negative. I'm really try as much as possible to be positive about the future. I don't think I could have lasted for the last 51 years without disciplining myself to see the good in others. At the same time, I made a promise to Krishna in 1986 when there was a revolution in ISKCON, really. There was a rejection of the zonal Acarya system, which to some degree persisted anyway. But I had tolerated some very bad behavior on the part of some leadership here in Los Angeles. And I promised to Krishna I would never, ever act against my own inner morality and judgment again, that I would remain true to my heart. And it served me well over the years. But I've also had to learn not to criticize a person, but to only criticize behavior. And there's a big difference in the two. And any parent knows that it's successful parenting means you distinguish between criticizing your child and criticizing the behavior. So if there's anything I've learned over these years, it's to always be wary of making that distinction. I think that every devotee essentially is sincerely motivated, but often our behavior gets in the way and covers our ability to be able to love someone. And I think that that's true in life, that we just keep learning how to transcend our human foibles and weaknesses so that we can truly give people our hearts. I have to end there because I have a further engagement. So
Yes, bro.
I'm happy to come back, but
Yes, bro. I'll quickly try to summarize what we discussed in a few minutes. So broadly, we started with your spiritual journey and how it is remarkable that a picture of Krishna and the artistic beauty of that picture attracted you. And then we focused on how it is not so much the logician within us that is attracted to Krishna, but it's more the heart is attracted. There is some kind of divine feeling, not in the sense of sentimentality, but some sublime sentiment that draws us toward Krishna. And Prabhupada was expert in tapping that resource through what he called the cultural presentation. Then we discuss how what culture is itself can be a big subject of discussion. And if we don't get the concept right, then we can be talking past each other. So culture in one could mean many different things, but essentially, when we are talking about culture, it's the entire aspect of human society, or you differentiate from tradition, what has been going on for a long time, but what attracts people to express their devotion, to express their spiritual instinct and act on it and move toward Krishna, take some steps toward Krishna. And the visual medium has not been utilized so much after Prabhupada, and which you have been a pioneer in trying to do that. And then one aspect of culture was also how we deal with each other. You said that you have that you know many devotees, but you're selective about your friends. And then we talked about how even Rupa Goswami says that like-minded devotee association is not so easy to have. We should focus on that. And as one aspect of culture is how we deal with each other. And in that connection, we talked about SABHA. So it's quite remarkable that Prabhupada himself envisioned and implemented the need for a check and balance through the temple president's body to review the GBC's resolutions. And that continued for some time, but was left. But now it has been adapted. And as the chairman for that, your focus has been more on having discussions and a family-friendly environment where everybody feels included and heard. And that is something which is vital. Otherwise, grievances grow and then they escalate. So accountability for the GBC, we talked about democracy and tenures and terms rather than lifelong. So Prabhupada, with respect to how the movement is to be managed, he never changed the philosophy, but with respect to how to go about applying the philosophy, he was quite resourceful. And then we discussed about how the Indian Yatra, Prabhupada, it was the Westerners that attracted Indians toward Prabhupada and toward Prabhupada's presentation of Krishna Bhakti. And now, when there is some kind of alienation between India and the West, it's almost like it's gone 180 degrees. But you could say it's more of a certain group of people having certain concerns who may not necessarily represent everyone together, everyone in a particular constituency. And toward the end, you mentioned that ultimately there are these two things. One is that these two things we talked about many things, that is, do we want a managerial style which gets things done in one particular way, or which allows for a diversity of voices, although it may lead to a little slower progress or slower movement of things. So the second is much better. And in one sense, democracy, there are, irrespective of the precedents in the Vedic tradition, it's the common sense. Prabhupada wanted everybody to be heard. That's how GBC works. And that's how the temple structure was also meant to be. And then there is that thin line which you have been treading. In one line, we don't want to criticize devotees, but at the same time, if some things are being done wrong, we can't stay silent also. So that differentiation which you made is an invaluable guideline, I feel like, for all parents also. You don't criticize the person, but we do need to point out the behavior that we find is wrong or harmful, so that the relationship is maintained. At the same time, there is improvement. So I hope and pray that the SABHA initiative helps in building bridges. As you said, Prabhupada wanted us to cooperate. So it helps build more and more bridges, so that we can actually do our work of attracting our own heart to Krishna and presenting Krishna in an attractive way through art and various other mediums to attract new people towards Krishna also. So thank you so much for your time, Prabhu. Look forward to other discussions in future also. Thank you so much for your time and your association, Prabhu. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Thank you, Chaitanya Charan.